Hello everyone, greetings from the 7th of Nero, AJ here with another look at military traditions in one of the Warmachine Hordes factions, albeit with a Mark III hat on now, given how the subject of today's brief look will be classified as a mercenary army, mercenary being a catch-all label encompassing those of that faction now, along with minions. That simplifies matters as far as the new list-building rules go, though I will miss the flavour of the separated forces. A perhaps strange aspect of minions, though, is the intra-factional rivalry. While no faction is free of political infighting, minions are unique, even accounting for mercenaries, for being composed of sub-factions who regard each other with outright animosity. At least most of the mercenary contracts or themes had, and likely continue to have, some measure of respect and acknowledgement for each other. Consequently, while a player can legally bring Farrow and Gators together in a minion list, in world, the amount of teeth-grinding of cooperation must necessarily go beyond any natural inclination for them to be at each other's throats on sight. Whoever paid them for this contract had better be sure the price was worth it. There isn't much extant history concerning the Farrow, for they came to prominence as an upstart local power within the Thornwood only after the Orgoth era became a bad memory among the peoples of Western Amoran. As to knowledge of their existence, this only became known, at least as far as scholastic pursuit is concerned, during that 800-year period, a fact of which makes accurately chronicling any race's history and diplomatic interaction, which puts it charitably in the case of the Farrow, awkward at best. Encounters with them during the Thousands Cities era and before were at best the stuff of folktales and local myths, leaving their origins an almost complete mystery. Indeed, their direct and bilateral dealings with the peoples of the Iron Kingdoms only stretch back a handful of decades to a century at most, when they offered services as hired muscle to regional petty warlords or naive targets of robbery. Concerning the perspective of the Farrow themselves, matters are not helped by their own, not so much shoddy as non-existent, record-keeping in such matters, for they care little for the accomplishments of their predecessors, and are instead focused on what they themselves can do now. I am led to believe it is part of their nature to be opportunistic, if adaptable, resulting in the innate desire to scrounge and plunder. Even so, the Farrow, or rather their leaders, have always been, surprisingly, quite self-aware in terms of their status in Amoran at large, appreciating the fact they cannot conceivably compete on equal footing against the more technological advanced or the more numerous. Hence, needs must they bring a different sort of ingenuity to how they go about their wars, while also picking their fights carefully. This last they have done so to varying degrees of success. This self-awareness extends to knowing how they are viewed by those they encounter, since they use their reputation as much as they can, being fearsome to those who might fear them, and being cowardly to those they cannot fight fairly. Nevertheless, their selfish nature as individuals has meant the only things they are bothered to recall or remember from generations past are proven skills, whether they be magical or martial. The Farrow place a lot of stock in personal prowess, exerted with minimal effort, though those who possess it are indeed very capable individuals, if in a highly unrefined manner. As a result, military traditions is not a term which is especially applicable to the Farrow tribes, even though some measure of commonality among them can be identified, best exemplified in the efforts towards unification undertaken by Lord Carver during the modern era. One may assume that, for the sake of making the disparate Farrow forces easier to supply and command on campaign, efforts were made to standardize things, even if it was mostly unintentional. In recent decades, the military of the various Farrow warbands was influenced most prominently by two key leading figures, Lord Carver, whose whimsical epithet does not bear repeating, and Helga, the Conqueror. For different reasons, not least of which was their respective goals in doing so, they took varying approaches to supplementing the strength of their respective forces. As such, these two leaders offer a contrast in what has become of the Farrow's rather slapdash military, as one may consider it. At the time when they made their agreement, thereby consolidating the so-called Thornful Alliance, the conflict between the Farrow and the Gatormen of the Blindwater congregation had been escalating over the past several years. The already difficult relationship shared between the two cultures was severely strained, not least by the intrusions of the more formal state powers of the Iron Kingdoms. Carver had, throughout his unification by conquest, relied on the innate combativeness of stronger Farrow to carry him to victory, along with a better grasp of tactics than the rivals he defeated. However, such an approach would not succeed in perpetuity, at least when regional powers eventually realized the extent of his influence and military power. What worked against lesser Farrow warlords would not necessarily work against the Gatorman Bokors, least of all bloody Barnabas, who would come to be Carver's most notable nemesis in recent memory. Having some inkling of what may come, but also because she knew she would need to contend with Carver's superior forces in some way, and at some point or other, Helga opted to afford the warriors of her warbands as much longevity as possible and instituted an almost civilized form of training upon them, so that the Farrow would not be so reliant on instinct. From the first years when the so-called Farrow menace became a problem for northern Signorans, they were formed in loose warbands composed primarily of brigands, armed with plundered weapons of mixed manufacture. Individual bands were, and continue to be, led by their local warlords who assumed their rank by being stronger and meaner than their peers. Unsurprisingly, such individuals have the pick of the spoils, weapons and treasure. Raids by companies of brigands would affect both the civilized and uncivilized, since opportunism is what they have long built their reputation upon. The Signorans, and then the Idrians, just happened to be the only ones who had a system of quickly disseminating information concerning the porcine raiders. But tribal folk who lived at the fringe of society were similarly troubled by the Farrow, human and otherwise. Any organised response was usually avoided, to be ambushed when they withdrew, whereupon the Farrow would easily restock on ammunition or new weapons. Because their focus on the immediately utilitarian, and knowing about existing equipment wielded by potential rivals, the Farrow do not decry their lack of manufacturing capacity beyond the most basic of gunsmithing, which is more about maintenance and repair than crafting. Thus, their equipment is often a generation old, but as they say, if it isn't broke, don't fix it, and their arms and armour serve them well enough for their purposes. Even so, there are those among the Farrow warbands who are a touch more bloodthirsty and more inclined to basking in the violence of battle, not content to stand back at range and let their guns do the damage. Slaughterhouses are thus suitably named, wielding nasty butcher's blades on their polearms, but not all Farrow warriors fight with weapon in hand. Among them is a small cohort of shaman-like magic users who use and exploit, by some means or other, the lingering mystical power of the newly fallen to support Farrow warlocks and warbeasts. In the latter case, support is perhaps a loose term for the almost more liturgical style of treatment the beasts are subjected to. No doubt they would be capable of more if they attempted to learn new applications of their magic, though I will not be the one to suggest it to them. One would hope they stick to their old habits and disregard anything they have not proven to themselves, even if there is no guarantee of an enterprising bone grinder among them, who may see the merit of new skills to take advantage of. But with an increase in their encounters, and with the more technological developed forces of the Iron Kingdoms, small victories won by the Farrow here and there brought to light the necessity for additions to their arsenal. In time these came in the form of plundered weapons, adapted not only for their warbeasts to carry into battle, but also for the warbands to easily maintain them and resupply their ammunition for their own use. New acquisitions included the latest forms of hand grenades, rudimentary artillery, and mines of various types, amongst other things. Just as quickly as obtaining these new weapons, warbands discerned the best ways of using them and promptly trained specialist units to carry out these battlefield roles. Over time, this resulted in the formation of several new companies to fight alongside the brigands and slaughterhouses, not least of which were the Farrow Commandos, Razorback light artillery crews, and sappers. With the newer of these cohorts came Helga's characteristic sense of discipline. Together, weapons and training afforded Carver and Helga a greater measure of ability to face more dangerous and more numerous enemies. And perhaps as a natural consequence of their similarities where, as well as alleged spiritual origins, military innovation is concerned, the Farrow would eventually ally themselves with the Trollbloods of the Thornwood in response to the Infernal Invasion. Like the Farrow, the struggles the Trollbloods experienced, if with different motivations, necessitated the adoption and adaptation to new technology and ways of doing battle. And this is despite it being against their natural inclinations and lacking the typical prerequisite knowledge, technical skill, and manufacturing capacity to develop their own designs, or meaningfully build upon what they currently have access to. Both cultures have dealt with these changes with characteristic aplomb, even if the Creoles did so in a more organised fashion. And indeed, their alliance gave ample opportunity to trade what knowledge of craft and tactics they could, difficult though it was at first. Farrow sentiments had most certainly been affected by the war against the Gatormen, which came to a head some years before. Though Carver seemingly defeated his counterpart Barnabas, the ancient Bokor's apparent death amidst so many fallen warriors from both sides of the conflict merely led to his ascension as the so-called Lord of Blood, facilitated by the preparation of mystical artifacts of considerable power well beforehand. Now led by an entity instantly revered as a god, and just as dreaded, the Gatormen counterattacked. The arisen god was eventually left victorious and in possession of the blood-soaked battlefield in the western Bloodstone Marches. But the Farrow persisted, retiring reluctantly, but still in relatively good order, aware that they were outmatched. Helga's leadership and policies on training and hierarchy, helped in preserving the integrity of the Farrow army, and in the aftermath they were grateful for the new god's hubris, for the Lord of Blood cared for the adulation of his worshippers, and envy for Kosk, the traditional god of the Gatemen, more than decisively beating his enemies. These wars no doubt changed the Farrow outlook on making war, and they have been busy during the peace which followed. Rumour has it that ambitions and attitudes have changed, that the Farrow wish to be fully unified, both culturally and geographically, into what amounts to a nation, so it remains to be seen what this means for their armies and they who would be their neighbours.